Hi, I'm Rob Penzak.
And I'm Larry Mendoza.
Welcome to Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century. We have an excellent show today. I want to give a special thank you to C.S. McKinney for putting us in touch with Mark Reimers, who's we're going to bring on in a few minutes. He's going to be a spectacular guest. Before we do that, I want to mention a couple things that are coming up. We're going to have John Christie on here in a couple weeks to talk about his new movie coming out, My Week in Atheism. Hopefully toward the end of February, we're going to have Lawrence Krauss on the show. Once we get that schedule firmed up, we'll let you know more about that. On March 23rd, Rob Boston will be here, talk about his latest book, Liberties, Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. And then on March 2nd, Jennifer Michael Hecht will be in on Skype to talk about two of her books, Doubt and Stay. So we've got a lot of good stuff coming up. Larry, do you want to tell us about a segment we're going to do at the halfway point?
Right. So we're going to start a new segment involving the Secular Student Alliance, and Liz Liddell will be sending us either a video every week or some other format to discuss secular student activism. And so we're going to show that at the half, at the break point during a public service announcement. So keep watching through that because it'll be interesting, and it'll be an interesting thing. Yeah.
All right. One thing we got to do, a little bit of news. I want to put on my puerile patriot hat to just echo some of the sentiments of our fearless leader, Mike Huckabee, who said that if the Democrats want to insult the women of America by making believe that they're helpless without Uncle Sugar coming in to provide them a prescription each month for birth control, just because they can't control their libido or their reproductive systems, that's a conversation that we Republicans want to have. And I just want to say that he's right, because I know my wife is always just pawing at me and her libido is just flying out of control. And Larry, I assume you have a similar...
Same thing. I mean, it's just out of control. I mean, the libido is just crazy.
Right, so,
we need to put this under control
Right,
somehow.
so women, join the GOP with us, get your libidos under control, because, like the Talmud says, thank God I was born a man and not a woman, Huckleberry's right there. Anyway, so that was our brief news segment for today. Now we're going to bring on Mark Reimers. Mark, thank you for joining us today. His doctorate is in statistics and mathematics, and he noted that after the Human Genome Project, there was a new demand for people that could use statistics to extract meaning from big data. So he'll tell us a little bit more what that's about. Larry, first, do you want to tell us, you have a relationship with Mark kind of that predates some of this?
Right, so yes, Mark has been, I've known Mark for a long time, probably since 2006 or 7, around that time, when I started the VCU Secular Student Alliance along with Roy Roberts. We started that organization, and Mark decided to be our faculty sponsor, and we didn't have one at the time, so we were very grateful that he stepped up and decided to help us out with that. So, as I said, I've been with him known him through a long time, and it's been great. He's a very smart and interesting guy. He's also not just a statistician, a biostatistician, but he's also a humanist, and he often gives talks at Unitarian churches and things along those lines, which I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. So
if we can bring Mark on, maybe you can start off, Mark, by telling us, a little bit about your perspective on humanism and the tie-in with the Unitarian Church.
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little bit of history first. So I was I used to be a fundamentalist Christian and sort of discovered humanism and atheism in my 20s, like so many do. And the Unitarian Church was probably the most open-minded sort of group of organized group of people toward humanist and atheist ideas at that time. And so I became somewhat associated with the Unitarians, and the Richmond Humanist Group is really an outgrowth of what used to be called the Atheists' Corner in the Unitarian Church, First Unitarian Church in Richmond, and that's been a forum for discussion of atheist and humanist ideas for the last 20 years, and we've recently grown and put on more events and are starting to do, have become a chapter of the American Humanist Association and are starting to do more outreach.
Well, this is going to be a true test of our wits, because we can barely hear you. So either God is messing with us or we're having some technical difficulties. So I'm imagining that the audience can probably hear you. We're having a tough time. You could pick up some of that. If we can get a thumbs up from the studio, just so we know if everybody outside can hear Mark, in which case we'll let him keep talking. Okay, so they can hear you, Mark.
Okay, great.
Now we can hear you too. So why don't we go, again, I'm sorry, I only caught something. I know I've talked to you about the church before. I would say that, the meeting that I went to with your, with the humanist group was really good. I know you give some other talks. And one of the important kind of separations is that you can still be a humanist, in that Unitarian setting, whether you believe in God or not, and whether you sort of have deistic inclinations, but you really try to make it an open, inclusive group. Is that fair to say?
Yes, we do. Okay. I mean, the essence of what we think humanism is concerted, thoughtful critique of, our positions, our beliefs, our ideas. So we encourage a lot of discussion rather than sermons or lectures.
Okay. All right. Now, the main thrust of today's show is going to be about the evolution of the human mind. Maybe you can just start off with a general feeling is why is it important? Why is it important for us to get a handle on what the human mind is, how it developed? Does that play into other aspects of your life in terms of politics and general thought processes?
Sure. I think that for me as a former religious person and for many people, one of the big questions is how does this material body, how do these neurons come to form memories, feelings, values, and all of the stuff that we used to call soul, and then many people still do call soul. So we want to understand what's special about our brains, how is it different from the brains of chimpanzees, and can we use that to understand how to live better with ourselves and with each other, and if there is such a thing as human nature.
Okay. Do you want to start, maybe just get things started? You sent us a video clip, we can show that clip, and then you can kind of describe to us how a chimpanzee would react in the same situation. We can go from there.
Sure. So this clip shows an adult teaching a child how to open a transparent box with a treat inside.
There it is.
I got him.
That was an interesting clip. Just a quick question on that clip. Was that the first try after the kid was watching the adult learning, or did it take a couple tries, or how did that work out?
An article that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a few years ago. And this is an experiment that's been repeated many times. And basically, you even at the grainy resolution of that video, you and I could see that most of the actions the child was taking were superfluous. And the thing that got the treat was the last move.
Right.
And interestingly, if you do exactly the same demonstration to an adult chimpanzee, or even a juvenile chimpanzee, they will also figure out, without any hesitation, what's the operative action, and they'll go right for the treat. Whereas in almost all the cases, the children, younger children, I mean, a teenager won't do this, but a young child will go through all of the superstitious ritual action, and then eventually take their treat. And we laugh at this and we think, maybe we're not so smart, but think about how easy it would be to discover how your cell phone works purely by trial and error. It's not so easy to discover how most things work in human culture by trial and error. So we think there's been quite a bit of selective pressure for this kind of over-imitation. And that seems to perhaps give rise to many of the less attractive aspects of the human mind, such as our propensity for superstition and false beliefs. But it seems to be, a byproduct of the quite necessary natural selection for, learning things that are, hard to pick up by trial and error.
So real quick, and that's interesting that you mentioned a byproduct of natural selection. So I know we've had guests here on the show. We've had Andy Thompson and some others who are studying and have written books about the evolution of religion, especially, and why we believe in gods. I know there's another author.
Well, Michael Shermer has Believing Brain, where he goes into why we believe in certain things.
Sure. And so I think there's two maybe competing hypotheses, whether religion is a direct product of evolution or a byproduct of it. And so that's interesting. And what's your take on that, Mark?
Well, I think that, as in so many scientific controversies about historical events, about evolutionary events, that the truth lies somewhere in the middle, and that we've been strongly selected for imitation, and that perhaps in recent years, meaning the last, perhaps 5,000 years, there's been some direct selection for religious conformity, which seems to, we might guess, would aid reproduction in the city-states of Mesopotamia and China and then throughout the world. But that's just speculation. I think we can be pretty sure that there was direct selection for imitation, and how much direct selection there is for religion, I'm not sure yet.
Can you say anything about how subject children are to that kind of learning, via direct imitation versus full-grown adults?
It seems that that's a good question. It seems that children are less discriminating or critical in thinking about, in their enthusiasm for imitation. Adults might be more discriminating, but it's not clear to me that adults are entirely rational or critical thinkers.
I think we can all agree on that. But just in terms of religion, how every religion really tries to grab the children when they're extremely young and start with the indoctrination process. And I think it's very interesting that you have some scientific backing to kind of show that children might be uniquely susceptible, while religion is hammering away at them.
So it's good. So why don't you, since this is, we want to talk about the evolution of the mind and the brain, especially, and how that works, Mark. Why don't you give us a little bit of a breakdown on how, some of these behaviors, especially in children and in adults, and how the brain has evolved to kind of lead us into this type of behavior and how we are today.
Okay, so I'm going to just rehearse a few basic facts for the audience. So one is that your adult brain weighs about 3 pounds, and it's made up of about 80 billion cells. The primary cells are what we call neurons, and these send and receive electrical signals from each other via synapses, connections we call synapses. Now, I think everyone on the show will remember that we are in the family of apes. We're supposed to have split from our common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos something like 6 to 7 million years ago. The exact date's a little hard to pin down. If you were to look at a chimpanzee brain, it would look very similar to ours. Really only an experienced neuroscientist could take one look and tell the difference. The only difference that you would see is that ours is considerably bigger. So ours looks the same shape, seems to have many of the same areas, but is considerably bigger. And if I could have the first figure, we can see that from the fossil record that most of that expansion is relatively recent. That is, we used to think that becoming brainy was the first step on the evolutionary road to humanity, but we have discovered in the last generation that, in fact, walking upright was the first step, and that the bigger brains didn't come until much later.
Can we throw that?
Have that figure there?
Can we throw that first slide up there, please?
So just to recap, Mark,
No, I don't think that's figure 1.
Okay.
Figure 01.
Well, just to recap, you said that it's walking upright was the first step. Is that correct? That's
Yes.
the first step. And just to kind of keep the conversation going, so the first step was walking upright. How does that necessarily relate to a bigger brain?
Well, it doesn't directly relate to a bigger brain, but it's going to relate to the unique impressionability of children.
Okay.
In an interesting way, and that is that because of the walking upright, our pelvises were considerably shortened, and I'll get to that in just a minute.
Okay.
But is it possible to get the brain size?
I think we're not. If they get the slides working, they'll let us know right now. I think we'll just talk about it. If they happen to get it worked out, they'll give us a signal.
Sure. Okay. So our most of the expansion of the human brain has happened just in the last 1.5 million years. So if you look at the evolutionary history of the fossil record, basically our bodies got bigger and our brains got bigger in proportion. So we were just like a bigger ape. But just in the last 1.5 million years, we've our brains have suddenly got dramatically bigger.
Okay.
Yes, there's the picture. Thank you.
There's the picture, yeah.
So you can see that there's, it's largely in the last 1.5 million years that we've gotten a brain out of proportion to our body size. And the question is why? Why was there so much selective pressure in the last 1 million or so years for a bigger brain? And there have been a number of hypotheses, one of which is that we needed it for our hands. And so if we could have the next figure, but if you actually look at other monkeys and apes, so the monkey's brain size is on the horizontal axis, and the group size is on the vertical axis, and you can see that there's a very strong correlation separately in monkeys with the black dots and apes with the white dots, a strong correlation between brain size or cortical size, strictly speaking, and our average group size. So it seems that...
And you said, just to be clear for the audience, you said each one of those dots is a separate species of either ape or monkey.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so you're... Okay.
If you're looking at the apes, the white circles, the orangutans are at the bottom, the gorillas, then the chimps, and then humans.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify for our audience a little bit, that was size of neocortex at the bottom. And
That's correct.
Can you define what the neocortex is real quick for our audience?
So a cortex means a rind, and that's a sort of insulting word for the part of the brain that's around the outside. So it's what you see on the outside when you're looking at a brain, and that seems to be where a lot of the details are stored, if you will.
Okay.
A lot of the motivations are more in the internal part, or the hidden parts of the brain. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the specifics, both for motor control and for association, are stored on the outside.
And if we're looking at what sets humans apart from other species, the cortex, it sets our thinking apart. The cortex is where that action would be at, largely?
We think so, yes. We've got a lot more cortex, although if I can bring up the next picture, yes, that picture, thank you. You can see that the distinct areas, which we can identify by their cellular composition and the layering of these layers, for every human area, we can find a corresponding area even in monkeys and certainly in chimpanzees. So that's a human brain on the left, a monkey brain on the right. And what has been indicated by colors is all of the distinct identifiable regions of the cortex. So they've got the same regions as we do, where ours are just bigger, although they're not uniformly bigger. Mm-hmm. So if I could go to the next picture, showing in particular, so our motor cortex is exactly the same size as a chimpanzee. So a chimpanzee, this is a picture of a chimpanzee's brain on the left, a human brain on the right. The areas I've highlighted with those circles are what we call the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And humans have proportionally much larger ventromedial prefrontal cortices than just expanding an ape brain. And these are areas that are implicated in social relationships, particularly attachment, loyalty, social approval, and guilt. So that if you're feeling that you've let the team down in some way, or feeling guilty about doing something that you shouldn't have done, then that area of the brain is particularly active. And there seems to be, even among different human beings, a strong correlation, meaning about 57% on the in one study, between the size of that region and the extent to which individuals are committed toward loyalty to the group.
We talked about, when Andy Thompson on, a very interesting study showing some brain slides and the association with an authoritarian complex. So people that tend to be very fundamentalist and accept authority have a different, you can actually see the different brain patterns. And I guess one thing I'd like to emphasize during this show is it's not critical that everybody understands statistics and mathematics and evolution to the degree that you obviously do. But everybody should be able to watch this show and see that when you're talking, you know what you're talking about, you've studied it for years, you see the way all sorts of fields interlock and come together to support it. In contrast to religion, which has this black box attitude, everything's a mystery, we can't possibly know it, let's not bother, just listen to me because I'm the voice of God. So one thing I'd like people to take away, and we'll have your contact information down there for people that want to hear more from you and learn more about this because they're interested, but there's an enormous difference between the scientific approach and what science reveals and what priests or imams or rabbis say they've heard from God. So they don't have to know it to your detail, but I find it very helpful just to hear you go into such detail.
Right. And just to comment a little bit on that image that you showed. So, was it the medial prefrontal cortex? Is that correct? Yes. So you said that was associated with things like guilt, and it's correlated to social organisms, right? Social animals. Yes. And it's interesting, and I know we've talked about this a little bit yesterday when we were chatting, that Frans de Waal has done a lot of work with apes and showed that the basis of morality, which is things like empathy and things along those lines, are not just uniquely human. And there's plenty of evidence, plenty of work from him and others, both in the lab and seeing them and studying these animals in nature, that they also show these types of human type of emotions, so to speak, of empathy, morality, fairness. They can understand that. So how does that play out with what you're studying and the medial prefrontal cortex? Is that there are other parts of the brain that are involved in this behavior?
So we typically don't see a lot of activity in the medial prefrontal cortex, or at least that ventromedial prefrontal cortex, when people are feeling empathy. You typically see more activity in the region of the medial prefrontal cortex that's sort of overhead, what we call the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, or what we call the cingulate gyrus. That's maybe 2 or 3 inches above the region that I've highlighted in that picture. And that's a place where you see a lot of empathy. That's also where you seem to feel the emotionality of pain. And it's pretty clear that apes can feel that and can respond with empathy. So I don't think that empathy is in any sense uniquely human. I would say, but you don't see a lot of guilt in apes, as far as I know, and you don't see a lot of sort of loyalty to sort of something deeper and beyond themselves. That seems to be a characteristic of humans, both for good and for ill.
That's interesting. So, but what about other species besides primates? Do we see this type of behavior or feeling empathy and things like that? I don't think we see very much in the way of guilt in other species, as most people who have dogs can attest. But there's quite a bit of controversy over how much evidence there is for empathy in other species. There was a study in Montreal that just a few years ago that claimed strong evidence for empathy among rats, so that rats would try to rescue other rats that were confined. Although interestingly, male rats would not try to rescue other male rats who were rivals. But it seemed that
this has of course been argued about. There's a huge, as you might imagine, a huge controversy over whether they're just responding to ultrasonic squeaks that these confined rats are making,
Sure.
Or whether they're actually moved by something like compassion. So the jury is still out on that, but my own inclination is that we probably haven't been paying attention to the evidence for compassion among other species, and that it's very likely they do have quite a capacity.
Right.
We're going to go to break in just a couple of minutes. Can I get you to go back, when we're talking about evolution, you mentioned this when we were talking yesterday, just tell a little about the story for people that aren't that aware of how evolution works. When we split, what happened in the Rift Valley, how do we think we became these different primates separated into different species?
And then after we come back from the break, we can go and talk a little bit about how the brain got a little bigger, and we'll go from there. So, yep, Mark?
Well, you look frozen there on our screen. Do you have it? Are you still with us there? All right, tell you what, why don't we head to our break, and then we'll come back afterward and continue the conversation.
Familiar territory for me, but I'm inviting you to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, on Fairfax Public Access every Sunday. Each week, the hosts tackle wishful thinking, religion, pseudoscience, and the harm they cause, with a combination of facts, humor, and community involvement. They challenge believers to defend their faith and give you, the skeptic, a voice. With live call-ins for viewers and streaming on the World Wide Web, there's never a dull moment. Don't wait. Look at them now on Facebook and YouTube, and remember to watch Road to Reason, a skeptic's guide to the 21st century, or there'll be hell to pay.
Welcome to Student News with the Secular Student Alliance. I'm Liz Liddell, the Director of Campus Organizing, and I'm here to share some of the most exciting secular events and news happening on high school and college campuses this week. Students were heavily involved in service events over the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. At the University of Northern Iowa, the UNI Freethinkers and Inquirers participated in a campus-wide service event that was so popular that it exceeded capacity, packaging over 5,000 meals for a local food bank. The Northern Arizona University SSA was a key participant in the atheist-led MLK Day of Service in Flagstaff, Arizona. Not only the first MLK Day of Service in Flagstaff, but also the first citywide atheist-led service initiative. We recently issued 8 awards for outstanding activism to SSA affiliate groups who demonstrated outstanding efforts in the areas of community, advocacy, service, or education. Events being recognized ranged from service projects and fundraisers to hosting standing room only debates and creating engaging and educational games. We'll be posting details of each award on our website at secularstudents.org over the next few weeks. Darwin Day is only a few weeks away, and our affiliates are gearing up for some awesome events. We're issuing several hundred Darwin Day celebration booklets to our affiliate groups and sending another several hundred for distribution to every representative and senator in the United States Congress. Student events in the works include lectures, tabling events, and, of course, birthday parties, complete with cake and ice cream. You can always learn more about secular students and their work on our website at secularstudents.org. This has been Student News with the Secular Student Alliance. I'm Liz Liddell, and I'll see you next week.
Okay?
You won't do that.
I won't do that.
But you can do it with the Bible all
Because
the time.
my salvation doesn't depend on a country song,
all the
John.
more reason why you should not do that with the Bible.
God is not supposed to be the author of confusion.
We are in disagreement. We have two completely opposing worldviews, and that comes out.
But John and I are good friends despite the fact that we understand we are clearly enemies in this social movement.
Guys like us shouldn't get along as well as we do, but we do.
Do you think I deserve to go to hell?
You're passing a judgment. You don't want God to pass a judgment.
Basically, John Christie heard my show, and he's been listening to a lot of atheist podcasts and stuff. He wants to do this documentary called My Week in Atheism, and he's staying with me for a few days. He's coming with me to Austin for the American Atheist Convention. He's one of these guys that we're pretty convinced is going to be an atheist in 12 months.
There are a generation of non-believers that are not coming from belief. There's a generation of non-believers coming around that never had it. And I think that they're going to have an attitude a lot like mine.
Simplest thing is, philosophically speaking, it is the lack of belief in a God or the rejection of theistic claims. It's not the assertion that there is no God.
I think people have a moral obligation to be reasonable, and I think once they're reasonable, they'll become atheists like me all by themselves.
If you have that simple definition for an objective moral standard, then everything the Bible teaches is immoral.
I'm trying to understand your side. You know, I'm not just holding my Bible tightly and saying I must believe. I'm welcoming your objections. Because it's really upon all of us to know why we believe what we believe and to be able to defend our faith.
Welcome back to Road to Reason. Thank you, Liz Liddell, for putting that together. We're really excited about working with the Secular Student Alliance, and look for John Christie on the show to talk about that movie in a couple of weeks. We also wanted to ask people, if you enjoy the show, think it's valuable, you're going to see a check down below. Please send us your support to Road to Reason, care of Fairfax Public Access. We will make sure that we put that money to good use, and we can use that help. And one other thing do we want to mention here. We also want to tell that any atheists out there, if you apply skepticism to religion and God, that's excellent. We'd like to challenge you to apply that kind of skepticism to everything. And if you believe in homeopathic medicine or all sorts of things that don't have a scientific foundation, call in and talk to us, and you'll set us straight or we'll set you straight.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because there have been a lot of, and I've recently been into debates with people that consider themselves atheists or skeptics, but then buy into some, they don't apply the same logic in things like, genetically modified foods or vaccines or things along those lines. And so it's very important that we apply the same level of skepticism and rational analysis to everything, not just what we think we should.
Right, the skepticism and atheism are overlapping communities, but not identical communities, and we all need to become more skeptical. So now let's get back to Mark. Let's pick up. I think we're going to not do any more graphics just because we're having a little trouble with that, so we'll just carry on with regular conversation from here.
Sure, that's fine.
So again, I wanted you to take us back to the start, with the Rift Valley. You said that there was a river there, kind of split the species apart, and talk about how that worked in setting humans on one path and other species on another.
Well, we're not entirely sure what happened. But the current leading hypothesis is that when the Rift Valley opened up, a group of our common ancestors with the chimps got marooned on the east side, which was drying out, and a group was separated from the group on the west side, which became the ancestors of chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees and bonobos split about 1 million years ago when the Congo River divided their habitat in half, and chimps can't swim. So they became separate species. They are both equidistant from us, although many of us like the bonobos a little better. But the human ancestors seem to have been in a more dry climate, and part of what they had to cope with was that they were not living in the deep forest anymore. They were living on the edges of the forest. And we speculate, we don't we don't 100% know, but we speculate that at the edges of the forest, they were seeing the kind of opportunities on the plains. For example, there were lots of packages of meat lying around, left by leopards and lions who had, killed an antelope and left, as lions do, left part of their kill. It's possible, we don't know why our ancestors took the two legs, but it's certainly possible to move faster, much more efficiently. And if you are stealing the lion's lunch, it really matters how you get around. So that may be one of the selective pressures that drove us to very early on walk on two legs in this drying climate. It also makes it much easier to avoid sunstroke. So for whatever reason, our ancestors on the east side of the Rift Valley seem to have been more pressed in a variety of ways than the chimpanzees' ancestors on the west side.
Right.
No, I was going to say that's interesting. First, one thing real quick. You mentioned that, we're bonobos and chimps were equally distant from both of them. And yes. I know that bonobos tend to be a more docile society, a more docile social structure, whereas chimps tends to be a little bit more aggressive. And what I find interesting is that humans share both of those. We can be very kind and gentle, but we can also be very aggressive and very angry towards others. So I find that interesting. And the other thing I guess this kind of leads into, so walking upright and a bigger brain. Let's get into that, how that kind of worked out.
Okay, so we began walking upright, or our ancestors began walking upright a long time ago, but we didn't start getting bigger brains until 1.5 million years ago, by which point we already had a lot of adaptations for walking upright. And one of those adaptations was the shorter, flatter pelvis. And I had some pictures of that, but it's quite striking if you compare a human pelvis to a chimpanzee pelvis, that it's much easier to give birth if you're a chimpanzee. It's not something that you and I, Larry, are likely to have to deal with, but half the human population does find out that it's not so easy giving birth to a human baby, whereas female chimpanzees don't seem to have nearly as much trouble. Mm-hmm. And part of the issue is, of course, if you're going to have a bigger brain, you need a bigger head. So what happened when we started getting bigger brains is that we also faced the problem of how to give birth, and one of the solutions was to give birth at a less mature state. So our human babies at birth, their brains are less than a quarter of the size of an adult brain, whereas for a chimpanzee, it's closer to a half the size of an adult chimpanzee brain. Now, this may seem like a quibble, but it actually has a substantial impact on because much of the human brain is still under construction during the first few years of life. And that means that the social experience, so human babies don't have an awful lot of direct experience with the world the way that, say, chimpanzee babies are. So chimpanzee infants can walk effectively or at least move around on their own after 2 or 3 months. Our babies take years before they're really mobile. As you're in this intense social situation, your brain is literally being reconstructed. Your cells are proliferating, synapses, connections between cells are proliferating at a rate much faster than those of a chimpanzee baby or child. And that social experience is quite literally shaping the connections in your brain in a way that doesn't occur so much for a chimpanzee.
But, I think one of your cool slides that you can talk about is how it's not just that you start as a baby and you get more and more and more cells until you're grown up. Like the spindle cells that went through, started low, got higher, and then they weaned some of those out, or weed out some of the ones?
Yes, so you actually have the most cells at just about 2 years of age. So if you've got a young nephew or niece who's perhaps 2 years old, they have almost 50% more cells than you do, or more neurons, more brain cells. Your brain is bigger, and that's largely in the cortex, reflecting the synapses, the connections between the brain cells that are growing. So you've lost a lot of cells since you were 2 years old. Many of these cells have been pruned off, and many of the connections are pruned down. So you presumably are keeping the ones that you use most, but it can also explain why human adults are considerably more rigid in their thinking than human children. And that, of course, is part of why many ideologies and religions as you said, that want to get people while they're young. Both the Catholic Church and the Communist Party wanted to get people and indoctrinate them when they're young.
Sure, and that makes a lot of sense, and not just in what you are picking up as a child as far as belief systems, but also it's much easier to learn anything when you're a child. I grew up bilingual, and I learned both English and Italian as I was growing up. Italian is actually my first language, but I started speaking English around the age of 4, maybe 4 or 5. And so it came to me a lot easier. And now I even have, I can pick things up a little bit easier because that was already wired into me, like different cultures, different languages. And that's an interesting fact that, yeah, you have so many connections and cells when you're young. And that's why I think the churches and everybody tries to go after the kids, always go after the kids, right?
And Mark, maybe you can say a word about, in the standard model for psychology used to see our brain as a blank slate, and then evolutionary psychology sees how we've been shaped. So, maybe you can just say a couple of words about evolutionary psychology and the development of the brain, how important evolution is to what we come pre-programmed to life with.
Okay, so one of the biggest psychological differences that we've discovered between humans and chimps is that we are much more capable of sharing attention with others. So that picture that I think was shown right at the beginning had a mother showing a child how to do things. It's very uncommon for chimpanzee mothers to show their children in that kind of patient, attentive way how to go about doing something. Chimpanzee kids pick up that, it's interesting to use a particular kind of tool, that you can crack nuts with stones, but they won't watch attentively how someone else is doing it and imitate them. They'll go and pick up a stone and try it themselves. And this, I think, is part of the reason why human beings sort of learn the prejudices and ways of approaching problems from others, as well as the specific actions and specific facts that we pick up from culture. So that's a big change. So it's actually relatively rare in the animal kingdom that animals will follow pointing. So if I point at something, your attention is drawn to that. Some domestic dogs could also follow pointing, but most animals cannot, and in particular chimpanzees will not figure out. This is surprising. We only discovered this about 10 years ago. But if I'm pointing you'd think that a chimpanzee, if I'm pointing to where a treat is, you'd think a chimpanzee would figure that there's something interesting hidden there, but they don't.
That's a great time for evolutionary psychology also, that there's not this great chain of being where humans are at the top and then the other great apes and then dogs somewhere down there. Each species kind of learns whatever works best for its niche. So if we were selecting out wolves to eventually become dogs, the ones that responded to our gestures, apparently got selected a little better. And we see that they did really well in that. And you mentioned something else about humans aren't necessarily the ones with the best memory, that there's some interesting stuff with chimpanzees being as good or better than humans for memorizing certain things?
Yes. So there's a Japanese researcher in Kyoto who is really famous for his sympathetic approach to chimpanzees. He really seems to have you could call him the chimp whisperer. He really seems to be able to connect with them in a way that most Western researchers cannot. He's shown that chimpanzees, if given a memory task that they can understand and that we can also understand, do much better than even memory champions in memorizing. And this task is, being shown a screen with a variety of objects in a variety of places and having to memorize where they all are and indicate where they all are. So they can actually do substantially better than we can at that task.
Yes, and I've seen a video of that. It's actually quite amazing. I mean, they flash up like images for like a quarter of a second, and the chimp can remember that. It's amazing.
Right, and just to go against the idea that God created us as the best species in his image, despite that we're all going to hell because we're sinners. But clearly we're not. We're good at the human social structure, and like birds can learn their area better. Each species does really well in its own niche.
So Mark, so we've talked about a little bit about the evolution of humans splitting off from chimps, the pelvis issue, how our brains have to develop a little bit more after birth as opposed to chimps. And we've talked a little bit also about, the difference in our brain between us and a chimps, and, some of what things that make us humans as opposed to chimps and apes. We do have a caller, and we'll take that call here in a minute. And after the call, I want to talk a little bit about the genetics of all of this, if you don't mind. So we have Zachary on the line calling us. So we'll patch Zachary in. He can ask his question, and we'll continue on. Zachary, are you there?
Yeah. Hey, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm okay. So I go to George Mason University, and when I turned on the TV, I thought, is this an atheist show? Pretty much.
Well, we talk about atheism, skepticism.
You guys are atheists, right?
Yes.
All right, me too. So when I walk around George Mason, I see a lot of religious proselytizing, and I think it's kind of goofy, and I just wanted to make a couple comments. Number one, can you guys debate Ken Hovind when he gets out of jail? Set something up.
You set it up and call us.
Is Ken Hovind getting out of jail?
Yeah, he's due for release pretty soon. And when I went to the George Mason kind of atheist group, it was a bunch of dorky guys. It was kind of embarrassing to show up to it. And I'm an atheist, and when I went there, I kind of thought, this is dumb. And I think it's important that atheists go up and say their opinion to combat, religious people or get more people represented in office who are atheists. But I don't think atheism in that sense has the thing to motivate them, because they don't think that what happens when you die is dependent upon this or something. So religious people are always going to have more motivation to go out there and say, do this for Jesus or something. And that's why I think atheism is just faced with some long challenges, because nobody in Congress or Senate right now admits to being an atheist.
Well, some of that may be true, but Mark, maybe you can answer this. Do you see any value, as if you're an atheist, do you see any value in life outside of God? I mean, do you have a hard time?
Any value?
Yeah, I mean, do you struggle to find some value in life, or do you think you're able to find that without a religious context?
I think I can, and I think most people really do, even if they say that they are doing it for God, so to speak. That it's the human relationships that we've built, and we've evolved, I think, to be an unusually social species, and to get a lot of our meaning from the good that we do for others and how others benefit from us and how they need us. So that we get more meaning from friendships and from children than, say, your average ape does. Most apes don't take much interest in their children if they're fathers. Only the mothers take an interest for a while. But human beings have, many fathers find it quite rewarding. I think that this is a kind of meaning that we are capable of getting because of our evolutionary history, that is not contingent on a belief in God.
Zachary, did you have any other questions maybe related to evolution or the brain for Mark? Okay, I think we're done with that. All right, Larry, did you want to follow up?
Yeah, so let's continue on and have a discussion on the genetics of all of this. So,
sure.
Go ahead.
So, if you actually compare the DNA of humans and chimps, you find that our proteins, the regions of the DNA that code for the machinery and the structure of our cells, is virtually identical in humans and in chimps. So there's that figure 98.5% identity that gets bandied around, and that refers to the protein coding regions. So if you could, if I had any hair left, you could swap that hair for the hair on a chimpanzee, and neither of us would know the difference. I guess I would be grateful for it. But if you actually look at the so-called junk DNA, we have many millions of bases inserted into our genome and some deleted compared to a chimpanzee. And we have many regions, many mutations that have been acquired in the DNA that affect the regulation of genes. So it's not so much that we make different proteins. Our proteins are almost all the same, but rather that we make them in different amounts and under different conditions. And in particular, we seem to have very different regulation for synaptic plasticity proteins. So we learn very differently.
Mark, can you quickly define what synaptic plasticity means? Because I think that's a kind of an ambiguous term, and that might...
Okay, so that means how the synapses, the connections between the brain cells, how they are changed by experience. And in an odd way, it seems that in some cases, our synapses are less plastic. That is, we don't change them as fast as those of a chimpanzee. And perhaps that accounts for why the chimps can do better at certain memory tasks. Whereas in other cases, we seem to change them under different conditions. And we're still working this out. This is an area of active research right now.
Yeah, that's interesting about plasticity, because that's exactly how we tend to learn, and the connections in the brain. And right now, there's a lot of research institutions that are working at exactly trying to figure out the circuitry and how it changes based on behavior and experiences. So that's a very interesting concept. But.
Maybe can you, we talked about this before too, where you're saying that since we're born in a very immature state as humans, our brain still has lots and lots of development to do, and to get to the point it needs to be, we actually go really quickly in terms of, so we don't watch our DNA as carefully for errors perhaps, and just to get, so talk about that a little bit, because I thought that was fascinating, and how it maybe ties in with neoplasia, or doesn't.
So, anytime you have cells rapidly proliferating in the body, there's the potential for a mistake in the replicating DNA. The most common kinds of mistakes are that a big chunk of DNA gets left out, or perhaps a chunk gets copied twice. And there's a paper that was just published in Science a few months ago showing that actually human neurons are riddled with these kinds of deletions of DNA. So there might be 1 million or 2 million bases just taken, a big chunk taken out of the middle of a chromosome in a number of neurons in your brain. And each neuron seems to have its own random deletion or excess bit of DNA. So that, part of the cost of the evolution of the bigger brain seems to have been that we actually have less perfect brain cells, or that our brain cells are in some sense riddled with more errors than they would have been if our brains grew at the same rate as an ape brain.
And part of
sorry, go ahead.
No, as I say, I know part of your research deals with the genetic tie-in to psychiatric disorders, but maybe you can go into that a little bit.
Yes, so as far as we know, chimpanzees and monkeys don't have the same kind of psychoses that human beings get. It's not entirely clear that we would know if they did, but we don't see any symptoms that look like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder among chimpanzees or monkeys generally. So we think that there may have, part of the cost of the evolution of human consciousness may have been a propensity for psychiatric disorders. And we're trying to investigate that now to see, we have now genomic data from human brains and from chimp brains and from monkey brains at all stages. And we're trying to make the comparison to see how the genes are acting differently at the different stages of brain development.
That's very interesting. I think, these disorders, psychological disorders that we see, and they've been at the forefront of the news recently because of all the mass shootings and things along those lines, seem to be, as you said, uniquely human. I wonder if they are like a byproduct of of the brain evolution. The same way sickle cell anemia, which is a disease and a disorder, is a byproduct of the evolution of blood cells to fight off malaria, even though sickle cell is not what fights off the malaria. It's actually the heterozygous genes for that. But unfortunately, that's just the byproduct
right,
of it.
God the creator could have designed a better way to handle that.
You would think.
But evolution does the best it can with what it has, and that's why we have sickle cell, and that'd be interesting. We'd love to hear your research as it develops, what kind of connections you do find to psychiatric disorders, the rapidity of brain, proliferation.
Yeah, so as Larry is quite right that whenever you have strong selective pressure, meaning there's a lot of mortality caused by a specific agent, in this case, you mentioned malaria, there's a strong selective pressure. So the ways that, evolution, the mutations arise that help you cope with that, but it's not necessarily all good.
Right.
And sickle cell anemia is perhaps the most egregious common example, but we think that very likely the strong selective pressure on brain size and complexity in human beings has brought along with it some not so pleasant consequences.
And is there a parallel? I haven't read this in a long time, so I'm a bit rusty, but with Tay-Sachs and some of the other brain development disorders, that there was a clear genetic tie-in, and they think that there's an evolutionary benefit to, I forgot if it was to the heterozygous condition. Maybe you can speak about that if you know.
I'm not. My understanding is that Tay-Sachs or heterozygous Tay-Sachs carriers have some protection against some infectious diseases, but I am not. I don't know that it has any benefits to the brain by itself. I think it's just that, again, the homozygous with the mutation have severe problems.
Okay, I'll look that up myself. I thought there was some benefit in terms of either the amount of but I'll have to look it up.
We're almost out of time here, but I wanted to ask you, how do you feel about Dawkins's selfish gene? And we have about less than a minute left, so make it fast if you can. I know it's a broad subject.
Sure. So I think that most of the empathetic or social social evolution that's happened in our psychology and our brains is probably driven more by the mother-child or parent-child bond than by altruism for the group. But I think that under the conditions under which our ancestors grew up, where they could freely take groups, and they developed
Mark, we're running out of time. We'll continue this conversation at a later date. Thanks for being on the show.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. It's good to talk with you. Bye-bye.
It goes by fairly quick. But thanks for being on the show. We'll definitely have you back on. I'm really interested to have you back on after you publish some work, some of your research, and we can talk a little bit more about that. Maybe that's very interesting.
Sure. We're just doing a couple of papers now. We're just about to submit a paper to Nature on the epigenetics of the brain.
Yes, that's another big subject I wanted to maybe
this will help. I hope so. And Lori, you're an amazingly strong woman, and kudos to you. And I hope this really turns out well.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Lori. Really, really appreciate sharing your story with us.
Please come back and join us next week.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining Road to Reason, and please make a donation for us.